I'm here with Emile DeVito of the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, and he's going to talk about mature forests and the benefits that they provide, as well as talking about steps that residents can take to better their local ecosystem.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. We're here in the Sauerland Mountains on a gentle northwest-facing slope, and we're in a really fascinating place. This is a patch of forest that's never been converted to agriculture. It's a fairly mature forest. It's probably been cut over many times in the last 3 or 4 centuries, but the one thing it has escaped is the plow. And so what we have is an undisturbed native soil, which means it's resistant to invasion by alien species. If you look here on the forest floor, it's not covered with Japanese honeysuckle, Japanese barberry, Japanese stiltgrass, Japanese wineberry, and all the other species from Europe and Asia that are invading most of our post-agricultural soils. This means that this forest is incredibly resilient. It has the capacity to support native species, even though much of the surrounding landscape is being overrun with invasive species. So we have a fairly mature forest. The trees are starting to get big. They might be on the order of 80 or 100 or 120 years old. We can see some shagbark hickories and some very large white oaks. And in the distance are some red oaks. The forest right now is not replacing those species. Most of the young trees in the forest are sweet birch. The deer that are far too abundant in this area don't prefer sweet birch very much, and they do prefer all the oaks and hickories. And so there are lots of oak and hickory seedlings at my feet. I can, in just one little circle here, I can see about a dozen hickory seedlings, and just off to the other direction are dozens of oak seedlings, but they'll never grow because every winter the deer will come along and chop them off. So right now, the forest is not capable of regenerating the species that are in the canopy. Now, it's true, those species need a little bit of light. Oaks and hickories, in order to replace themselves, need a little sunlight that can come into the forest when a few trees fall down or die from insects or disease. And sweet birch and beech and maple and some of the other species that are coming up here don't need as much light. So if nothing changes, this forest is going to slowly convert from an oak hickory forest to a birch and beech and maple forest. That's fine. Those plants are incredibly valuable for wildlife. In fact, they host many species of caterpillars for butterflies and moths, and they provide lots of food for various wildlife. There's a common belief that, the trees that have nuts are more important for wildlife, but that's because most people like the trees that have nuts because they support game species. But there are hundreds of other species that don't need those nuts and also depend on the other diversity that's in the forest. So what's going to happen to this forest? If there aren't any storms, if there aren't any fires, this forest is going to, these old hickories and oaks, they're not old yet. They're just starting to get old. They'll live a couple of more centuries, and they'll become massive trees. Some of them won't make it. There'll be logs all over the place. And then there'll be a younger forest of birch and beech and maple coming up under these massive 3- and 4-century-year-old oaks and hickories. That's kind of like what the forest looked like when the colonists arrived. Scattered massive trees that were centuries old, and then patches of young trees in between all those old giants in the forest. We don't really see that anymore because not enough time has passed for that to happen again. Now, the one thing that is happening now is we're getting lots of storms. We're getting lots of insect outbreaks. Sometimes those are pathogens and alien species that are killing our trees. And so gaps are opening up in the forest. So we're going to move just a short distance to a gap that's been created as a big ash tree died probably from ash yellow's disease or perhaps emerald ash borer. And we're going to see what's going on in that light gap. We've walked just a few feet into the light gap that's been created by the death of a very large 18-inch diameter ash tree. And some things, it's only been dead about maybe 2 years. And so some things are already starting to happen in this light gap. There's a very young multiflora rose, which was here probably as a tiny little seedling waiting for light, and now it's grown up as high as my belt. And there's a Russian olive that was also probably sitting here waiting for something to happen, and it's growing up into the light gap. And along with those invasive species, there are hickory saplings that have gotten much bigger than the ones in the woods in just one growing season because they've had more light. And then there's a sweet birch tree which is starting to rocket up into the gap. And so this is likely going to be the winner in this gap. This sweet birch is going to become a big tree eventually and fill this gap. Down at my feet there's an oak seedling, a white oak seedling in amongst the hickory seedlings. And what we need to do if we want to make sure that native species take over this gap is to get a fence, maybe about 500 feet of fencing, and make a big circle about 20 or 30 feet into the forest by wrapping the fence around all the remaining big trees and keeping the deer out of this circular light gap. And if we do that, these native species will win out. Native shrubs will grow. Occasionally there's a maple leaf viburnum that's been sitting here as a rootstock probably for 30 or 40 years. And as soon as we put a fence up and take the deer away, that maple leaf viburnum is going to grow up to be 6 to 8 feet tall. There's also a black haw viburnum right behind this beech tree, which is struggling to grow up. That will also grow up and fill the light gap. And once you get that native shrub layer, all the invasive species will disappear. We have fences that have been up for 25 years, 30 years in some little test plots in other parts of the New Jersey Piedmont. And as soon as you establish a native shrub layer, the invasive species almost completely disappear and become irrelevant. And that includes some of the worst ones like Japanese stiltgrass and Japanese honeysuckle. There's one alien species that we are worried about, which is a species of viburnum that actually does like the shade and can get tall just like our native viburnums. And so you have to watch out for some of these alien viburnums. If they show up in your forest, you have to make sure you get rid of them as fast as possible. But you can't do anything unless you put up a fence. Every native plant needs to be protected from deer. There's no way to lower the deer enough to make the forest heal. You absolutely, if you're going to do ecological restoration, you absolutely have to have a fence. Any other money that you spend on plants, on water, on tree tubes, all that will be for naught if you don't have a fence that keeps out the deer. Right, well, it's sort of a stepwise process, like a cookbook. First you have to know what you have. If you have soil that's never been plowed, then you can accomplish a lot simply by putting up a fence and letting nature take over. If you have, after you put up your fence, if you have some extra money, you can buy native plants. But you really need to watch those native plants because if we get a drought, they need to be watered, probably for the first 2 or 3 years. So you can't just throw plants in the ground and walk away because sooner or later a drought's going to come along and they're not going to make it until they develop really large root systems. Also buy small plants. Don't buy big plants because big plants come in containers and the roots stay root bound for too long, and the big plants have so many leaves that as soon as you get a dry spell, they dry out. The big plants have lots of leaves that are evaporative surfaces, and they can't deal with a drought because you're not standing there with a watering hose. So you have to buy small plants, protect them from the deer. The small plants have very few leaves, and then they don't evaporate all the water in their tissue that quickly, and then they can send out roots, and then they can become strong, and they don't need your help anymore. So that's what you do if you have native soil. If you don't have native soil, it's a much harder thing. You can still do restoration work. You can still try to replace the alien species with native species, but you're going to have to work a lot harder removing the alien species so that they don't smother your native plants. Post-agricultural soil that's been plowed for centuries is not a forest soil anymore. It's too nutrient rich. The pH is too high. It's probably got earthworms. All of those are bad things. So when you have post-agricultural soil, you need to reduce the soil pH. You could do that with sulfur on small patches. You can still put up a fence. You have to work much harder to keep your plants alive, and you have to work much harder to remove invasive species. So the easiest thing to do is, it's not 100% accurate, but it's accurate almost all the time, is to look at the 1930 aerial photographs, which you can easily see on Conservation Blueprint, which is a website that was put together by a number of organizations and Rowan University. And the one of the backgrounds that you can pull up is the 1930 historic aerial photographs. And when you do that, you can easily tell the difference between forest land and farmland in the aerial photograph. And if it was forest land in 1930, it's almost certain that it would have been forest land for many years before that, maybe always. And if it's still forest land, then you can be pretty certain that it's never been plowed. It may have been grazed. Almost everything in New Jersey was used for some type of agriculture at some point. Even woods that were just cut for lumber would often have been grazed. But the soil would not have been heavily disturbed, and that's why now when you go to one of those places, the soil is incredibly healthy and you have lots of native species and very few alien species. I'll show you what one of those aerial photographs looks like. When you zoom in to the exact spot where you are, you'll see that you might be embedded in some very dark forest, or you might be in what looks like a field. And you can see those things very clearly and easily, and that will help you determine whether or not your land was ever used for agriculture in the past. There is lots of land that you will be in the woods and you'll think that it's been forest forever, but even if you look at a 1930 aerial photograph, you'll see that it was agricultural, because a 70 or 80 or 90-year-old forest doesn't always have easily detectable signs of being plowed and being agriculture in the past. However, the soil is very different and the plant species will be very different. Right, well, there's no substitute for getting a field guide to trees and shrubs, and there's no substitute for getting a book called Newcomb's Wildflower Guide, because if you have those two books, you can identify all the native plants that you have. As far as alien species go, it's better to look on websites for the alien species of New Jersey, because when something's not in one of your books, it's likely going to be on a website listed under the worst alien invasive species in New Jersey. It might seem daunting to learn the plants, but it's really not that hard. The trees and shrubs, there are only a few dozen that you have to learn. You can pretty much learn all the trees and shrubs that grow on your land in a weekend, especially in the springtime when you have fresh leaves and twigs, or if you have in the summer if you have flowers, or in the fall if you have fruits. The field guides show all these things, and you only have to learn a few characteristics to be able to sort out which plant you have. It's really not that hard. As far as the wildflowers, that takes a lifetime. But you'll learn the common ones right away, and then you'll know them, and then when you find something rare or unusual, you realize that you've never seen it before, and that can be really exciting.